They entombed them, flooded the tunnels, paved them over with concrete, and buried them beneath federal land designations. Thousands of mines across the western United States, the Appalachian Range, and the vast plains. Operations producing tens of millions in mineral wealth, employing hundreds of thousands of people, entire towns built around their infrastructure, all shuttered, sealed, and erased from public memory in a single generation. The official explanation: the veins ran dry, but the veins did not run dry. Mine after mine had geological assessments completed just prior to their closure that showed decades of profitable deposits still in place. Some indicated centuries of potential yield. In 1912, a federal mining inspector working in Colorado recorded rich silver veins that, by his own calculation, could have supported extraction for another 300 years. That mine was shut down just 6 years later. The shaft was capped in 1921. By 1930, the adjacent town had been demolished. Today, a national forest covers the site, and the mine entrance appears on no official government map. So, why were they shut down? Subscribe if you're new to this channel. We uncover the history your textbooks omitted. Hit the notification bell so you never miss what's coming next. That question leads down a path most academics refuse to follow. It leads to the calculated destruction of an underground infrastructure so sophisticated that its very presence forces us to rethink everything we think we know about 19th century America. Tunnels linking multiple states, air circulation systems whose designs still baffle modern engineers, processing rooms carved from solid granite with a level of precision no hand tool from that era could have produced. And it leads inevitably to the civilization that created them, not the one we were taught about, but the other one. This is the true reason America abandoned its pre-1900 mines, and it was never about a lack of ore. The story begins not with a bang, but with a number that simply doesn't add up. In 1880, the U.S. Census recorded 594 active mining operations nationwide. By 1920, that figure had fallen to 211. By 1940, it was under 800. The standard explanation: the great mineral rushes had stripped the easy-to-reach deposits. Corporate consolidation eliminated smaller players, and extraction economics shifted. That story works on the surface. It falls apart the second you examine the actual data. Most mines closed between 1890 and 1920 were not economically depleted. They were fully operational. Some were at their peak output. The Comstock lode in Nevada is the classic example. Major operations shut down by the 1890s. The official story blames exhaustion. But in 1902, a private survey commissioned by a San Francisco investment group found accessible silver and gold at deeper levels, perfectly reachable with existing technology. That survey was never released. The investment group dissolved within a year. The deeper deposits were never touched. That same scenario, a promising resource survey followed immediately by abandonment, plays out repeatedly across the American mining record of that period. In Michigan's Upper Peninsula copper ranges, production was winding down by 1910, officially lower-grade ore at depth. But internal documents from the Calumet and Hecla Mining Company, partially declassified years later, showed their deep-level surveys from 1908 and 1909 had found ore of comparable quality to what they had mined profitably for 4 decades. They halted operations anyway and shifted investment to copper projects in Chile and Arizona. Why travel to South America when the copper was still in Michigan? Official historians call it corporate strategy. That's not entirely false, but corporate strategy doesn't occur in a vacuum. Look at who was applying pressure, and a different picture emerges. Not simple economics, but a coordinated effort to keep Americans out of the underground. Before we can understand what they found down there, we need to understand the mines themselves. The operations being closed in this era were not the primitive pick and shovel affairs of popular legend. They were engineering achievements that, in many documented cases, could not have been built by the people who supposedly ran them. Consider the Sutro Tunnel in Nevada, officially completed in 1878, a drainage and access tunnel for the Comstock mines, driven 2,570 feet through solid rock at a depth of 1,640 feet below the surface. 9 years to build. The official record credits a workforce of European immigrant miners using hand drills, black powder, and horse-drawn ore carts. Now think about what that actually means. Over 20 0 feet of tunnel through granite and basalt, perfectly graded for drainage, with ventilation shafts placed at exact intervals to maintain airflow. Done by men with hand tools. Modern engineers who have studied the Sutro Tunnel have raised questions that have never been adequately answered. Maintaining a drainage slope of 5 feet per 100 feet across nearly 4 miles of underground excavation in the 1870 would have required surveying precision that's hard to explain with instruments available at the time. The placement of ventilation shafts reflects an understanding of fluid mechanics that wasn't formalized in engineering texts until decades later. Adolf Sutro, the man credited with building it, was a Prussian immigrant with a background in retail and only a modest technical education. He lacked the engineering credentials to design what was actually built. Within a few years of the tunnel's completion, his financial backers pressured him to sell. The tunnel transferred to a company controlled by interests whose ownership chains trace back to a network of European financiers who were simultaneously acquiring and then closing mining infrastructure across the western United States. The Sutro Tunnel is still there. It has never been fully explored. Access is restricted by the Bureau of Land Management, but the Sutro Tunnel is modest compared to what was being found elsewhere. In 1891, a mining crew working an expansion drift in the Crescent Mine near Cripple Creek, Colorado, broke through a wall of ore bearing rock and entered a chamber that should not have existed. The room was 40 feet wide, 60 feet long, and 20 feet high. The walls were solid quartz crystal coated in gold. The floor was smooth, not worn smooth by water, but smooth in the way a finished floor is smooth, with a consistent flat plane extending across the entire chamber. The Crescent Vug, as it became known, was the single richest gold discovery in American history. Over the next several months, miners extracted somewhere between $1, $2 million and $12 million in gold directly from the walls. The records vary suspiciously in their accounting of the total. The chamber was then dynamited and sealed. The official reason, structural instability, but that explanation doesn't account for the floor. Natural rock chambers, geodes, and vugs form through specific geological processes. Yes, the walls of a vug can be covered in crystals, but the floor of a vug is never smooth. Natural processes do not produce flat, level floors in underground rock chambers. That requires intent. That requires tools. That requires someone at some earlier time to have stood in that chamber and worked it. The Crescent Vug is not unique. It's the most famous documented case because the gold value was too extraordinary to completely suppress. But similar discoveries were reported in mines across the American West throughout the latter half of the 19th century. Chambers with finished floors, tunnels predating any known mining operation in the region, ventilation passages connected to shafts that appear on no surface survey, and in several cases, symbols and geometric patterns on the walls, photographed by mining company, surveyors, and then erased from the record. Something had been in the American underground before the 1008. 149 prospectors arrived. Something had been working those ore bodies for a very long time, and the people in charge of 19th century mining operations knew it. This is where Tartaria enters the story, not as a fringe internet theory, but as a documented historical problem that mainstream scholarship has chosen to gloss over rather than resolve. The Tartarian hypothesis proposes that a technologically sophisticated civilization occupied significant portions of North America prior to European colonization, possibly persisting into the early 19th century, and that evidence of this civilization was systematically suppressed after whatever ended it. The physical evidence, the inexplicably large civic buildings, the star fort designs in American cities, the mud layers burying the ground floors of structures supposedly built above grade, is real. The buildings exist, the mud layers exist, the anomalies are genuine. The mines are the piece that most Tartarian researchers have not fully explored. And the mines may be the most important piece, because if a prior civilization occupied this continent, it needed resources. A technologically advanced civilization requires metals, copper for conduction, silver for applications that the standard historical record would call far ahead of their time, gold for purposes that go well beyond monetary value in cultures with sophisticated knowledge of its physical properties, and that civilization would have mind. The answer, based on the accumulated evidence of anomalous chambers, pre-existing tunnel systems, and inexplicably sophisticated infrastructure in the American mining record, is that they mined exactly where the 19th century prospectors found the richest ore bodies, because the ore bodies were rich precisely because they had already been worked down to the highest concentration zones. The area's surface prospectors approaching from above would encounter first. The 19th century American miners were, in many cases, re-entering mine systems that already existed. They were following tunnels driven by someone else, finding chambers carved by someone else. And at a certain point, the people controlling these operations decided the workers needed to not be down there anymore. The timeline of the closures tracks with something else, something that the standard economic history of American mining doesn't adequately explain. Between 1890 and 1910, the U.S. government dramatically expanded its authority over mineral rights and public lands. The General Revision Act of 1891 gave the President authority to withdraw public lands from entry and settlement. It was used immediately and aggressively to create forest reserves, placing vast mineral-rich territories beyond the reach of independent prospectors. Theodore Roosevelt, in his first term, withdrew more land from private development than any president before him. His stated rationale was conservation. His actual effect was the removal of independent access to the most geologically significant regions of the American West. This was not conservation. This was land clearance. The USGS was documenting the underground geology of the American West with extraordinary thoroughness. Their surveys found ore, they found a great deal of ore, and the response to finding ore was not a rush to extract it. The response was to classify the land, restrict access, and move on. The USGS survey records from this period are not fully publicly available. Some original field notebooks are in the National Archives. Others are not accounted for. The detailed underground maps have a way of being incomplete in precisely the areas most geologically interesting. This is not paranoia. The gaps are not random. They cluster around the areas with the highest ore concentrations and the most reports of anomalous underground structures. There is a mine in Arizona that serves as a case study for everything we have discussed. The Vulture Mine in Maricopa County was officially discovered in 1863 by Henry Wickenburg, a German immigrant who claimed to have found gold ore on the surface and followed it down. Over the next 30 years, it produced somewhere between $200 million and $300 million in gold at current values. For a time, it was the most productive gold mine in the territory of Arizona. It was closed in 1942. Official reason, wartime resource redirection, but the Vulture Mine was nowhere close to exhausted. A 1937 survey by the Arizona Bureau of Mines had found viable ore at depth representing, by their own conservative estimate, approximately 40% of the mine's historical production still in the ground. 40% of one of the most productive gold mines in American history left in the ground during a war consuming unprecedented quantities of gold and silver for electronic and military applications. This makes no sense unless the reason for closing had nothing to do with the war and nothing to do with the ore. The Vulture Mine also has anomalies, tunnels that, according to the oldest maps of the site, predated Wickenburg's arrival, a lower level not on any official plan. In 1994, spelunkers accessed it through a secondary entrance and found a chamber with worked stone walls, a water management channel carved into the floor, and a grid pattern carved into the ceiling that they could not explain. They published their account in a small Arizona history journal. The secondary entrance was sealed by the Bureau of Land Management the following year. The Vulture Mine is now a tourist attraction. You can tour the surface structures. You cannot go below a certain depth. The lower levels are officially off limits for safety reasons. The pattern of what was found, sealed, and restricted is too consistent to be coincidental. But understanding why it was suppressed requires understanding what a prior civilization's mining infrastructure would mean for the official history of this continent. If the ore bodies in American mines were as rich as the 19th century miners first encountered them, and if those levels showed evidence of prior extraction, then the prior civilization did not extract the ore from the top down the way the 19th century miners did. They extracted from the bottom up, or from horizontal entry points, working the ore body in a way that left the surface, adjacent zones still intact and accessible. This is advanced mining practice. It implies knowledge of ore body geology, an ability to map subsurface structures, and an understanding of extraction sequencing comparable to modern industrial mining methodology. It also implies something about scale. If they were working ore bodies across the American West, the Appalachians, the Great Plains, and the Great Lakes copper ranges simultaneously, they were operating at a continental scale with logistical infrastructure to move materials, labor, and technical knowledge across thousands of miles. They had roads, communication systems, and in all likelihood, the kinds of fixed infrastructure, bridges, aqueducts, civic buildings, that Tartarian researchers have been documenting for years. And then they were gone. How they were gone is deeply contested. The mud flood evidence suggests a catastrophic deposition event that buried significant portions of their surface infrastructure. Buried building foundations, city plans that don't match the supposed founding dates, star fort designs appearing in American cities decades before the military theory that supposedly inspired them. This evidence is consistent with a civilization that was first buried and then erased from the record. What happened to the mining infrastructure was different. It was not buried by a natural event. It was actively sealed by the people who inherited the continent, who spent decades methodically closing access to the underground before the general population could appreciate what was down there. There is a man named John Whitfield, whose name does not appear in any standard history of American mining, but whose story illustrates what happened to the individuals who got too close to the truth. Whitfield was a mining engineer who worked for the USCs from 1887 to 1901. His field notebooks, portions preserved in the Colorado State Archives, described discoveries spanning his entire tenure. He documented tunnels predating known mining activity across Colorado, New Mexico, and Utah, chambers with worked surfaces, ventilation systems of a complexity that, in his own words, exceeded any contemporary engineering capacity to construct. In his notebooks from 1898 and 1899, he began documenting what he called the pattern, the geographic clustering of anomalous structures along lines he believed were intentional, a connected subterranean infrastructure that had once served purposes he was attempting to map. In 1901, Whitfield submitted a formal report to the USCs requesting authorization for a systematic survey of what he called the pre-existing tunnel network in the Four Corners region. The report was declined. He was transferred to a survey of coastal Georgia, as far from the Four Corners as you can get while remaining on federal employment. He resigned in 1902. After his resignation, Whitfield attempted to return to Colorado independently to continue his survey. The sites he had previously accessed were now restricted. Several had been sealed. His applications for access permits were denied without explanation. He died in 1911. His private papers, whatever remained of his systematic documentation of the underground network, are not accounted for. John Whitfield is a single data point, but the pattern his story represents, the engineer who sees too much, tries to report it, gets redirected and frozen out, whose documentation disappears, this pattern repeats across the American mining record of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The engineers knew, the geologists knew. And one by one, the people who knew were removed, and the physical evidence they had documented was sealed underground. Let's talk about the copper. The copper story is, in some ways, the most important part of this investigation because it is the most anomalous, the most extensively documented, and the most thoroughly suppressed. The Upper Peninsula of Michigan contains the largest deposit of native copper on Earth. Native copper, occurring in metallic form rather than as ore requiring smelting, is extremely rare globally. For a technologically sophisticated civilization, it would have been a miraculous resource, no smelting required. Extract it, shape it, use it. The Michigan deposits were mined before the Europeans arrived. The old copper complex dates back at least 7 zeros, 0 years. The standard story describes small-scale artisanal operations, native peoples making ornamental copper from surface deposits. But the physical evidence does not support that story. Miners working the Upper Peninsula in the 1008, 140s, and 1050s consistently reported encountering pre-existing works underground, pits, trenches, tunnels, ancient copper masses that had been partially worked and then abandoned in place. One survey from 148 estimated that ancient excavations along a single ridge in Kuna County represented the removal of approximately 5 billion pounds of copper. 5 billion pounds from a region that standard history describes as being worked by small groups with stone and bone tools for ornamental purposes. 5 billion pounds of copper going somewhere, driven by some civilization with the organizational capacity to move that quantity of material. The mainstream archaeological response is inadequate. The old copper complex timeline keeps getting pushed back as new dating evidence comes in. The question of where 5 billion pounds of copper went is answered with trade networks and ceremonial use. Explanations that account for grams and kilograms, not for quantities that would have supplied an industrial civilization. The 19th century mining operators in Michigan knew what they were walking into. Their internal documents show awareness that they were inheriting infrastructure. The larger copper companies, in several documented cases, systematically destroyed evidence of the prior works as they expanded. Ancient timber shoring was pulled out and burned. Ancient copper masses showing evidence of prior working were processed without documentation. And when the companies withdrew from the Upper Peninsula around 1910, they left behind underground structures they had been careful to conceal from anyone who might ask the wrong questions. The convergence of all of this, the anomalous tunnels, the sealed chambers, the inexplicable infrastructure, the deliberate destruction of evidence, the systematic closure of viable mines, restriction of access to underground spaces surrounded by federal land designations, converges on a central question. What were they protecting? Not from the miners. The miners already knew. The miners were being removed from the public, from the generation that would come after, raised with no memory of what had been common knowledge in the mining camps of the 1870s and 1880s, educated in institutions that taught a history beginning with Columbus and progressing tidally to industrial expansion, a history with no room for a prior civilization and no framework for understanding what was underground. The closures were not about the ore, they were about controlling the access points. Every sealed mineshaft is a door that has been locked. Every federally restricted underground structure is a room that someone decided you should not be in. The question is, what is still in those rooms? The tunnel systems documented by 19th century mining engineers and then sealed represent an underground network with no analog in any known ancient civilization on this continent. Tens of thousands of miles of tunnels, chambers of a precision implying purpose far beyond simple ore extraction. Ventilation systems representing sophisticated engineering, water management channels. Their geographic distribution tracks not ore bodies alone, but deliberate connectivity, something built as infrastructure, not just as mining works. A continental pattern of sealed mines, destroyed evidence, redirected engineers, and restricted lands does not happen without coordination. Someone knew what the mines contained. Someone had the authority and motivation to ensure the general public did not find out. The entire apparatus of what would become the Bureau of Land Management and the United States Forest Service was built functionally on top of that suppression effort. Then there is the physical evidence that slipped through. In 1982, a mining company surveying for copper in Arizona near Globe used ground-penetrating radar and found what their team described as regular linear anomalies at depths between 80 and 400 feet, inconsistent with natural geological formation and consistent with artificial tunnel structures. The permit was denied. The survey data was classified as proprietary, removed from public records requests. The company's geologist retired the following year and told a trade publication the returns were the most significant geological discovery I have ever been involved with. He had been advised by legal counsel not to discuss them further. He did not discuss them further. The survey site region was designated a protected wilderness area by executive order within 2 years. None of this can be fully proven within the framework of the standard historical record, because that record was constructed in part to exclude exactly this kind of evidence. The surveys are classified or missing. The engineers who documented the anomalies were redirected or discredited. The physical access points are sealed. But we can look at what we do know, the mines that closed with ore still in the ground, the geological surveys that found viable deposits followed not by mining but by federal land restrictions. Billions of pounds of copper that went somewhere from a region official history describes as lightly populated with artisanal metal workers. We can look at the Sutro Tunnel, which required engineering knowledge its supposed builder did not have, at the Crescent Vug, which had a floor that nature does not make, at John Whitfield's missing papers, at the 1982 Arizona radar survey that was immediately classified. We can look at the pattern. And when you look at the pattern, the conclusion is not comfortable. It describes a civilization that was here before us, that worked this continent's underground resources at a continental scale, that left behind an infrastructure we do not fully understand, and that someone with significant power and resources decided we should not be allowed to discover. In 1909, the Smithsonian Institution sent an expedition to the Grand Canyon, led by a man named G.E. Kincaid, to investigate reports of a cave system with anomalous contents. The findings were reported in the Arizona Gazette on April 5, 1909, describing an extensive underground complex containing Egyptian-style artifacts, hieroglyphic inscriptions, copper and gold objects, and mummified remains. The Smithsonian has officially denied that this expedition ever occurred. There is no G.E. Kincaid in their employment records. The Grand Canyon site described in the article has never been publicly investigated. The Grand Canyon is federally managed land. In 1928, miners in southern Illinois working a coal seam broke through into a chamber containing machinery of unknown function made from materials they could not identify, in a state of preservation. Inconsistent with any age they could estimate, the company sealed the chamber, dismissed the workers, and filed no official report. 2 workers later tried to report the discovery independently. One was institutionalized, the other relocated and never spoke of it again. This is from the historical record, incomplete, fragmentary, the kind of record that gets made when someone is trying to suppress something but cannot do it completely, when too many people saw too much. In 1974, a group of amateur historians in Nevada filed a Freedom of Information Act request with the USCs seeking access to survey records from the Comstock mining region covering the period 1910. The USCs responded that the records in question were classified under a national security designation applied in 1917 and never revisited. They were denied access. USC's Geological Survey records from the 1880s, classified under a national security designation applied at the height of World War I, never declassified. What is in a geological survey from the 1880s that rises to the level of national security? The answer to that question is the answer to everything we have been discussing. The mines are still down there. Most are sealed but not destroyed. The ore is still in place. And the structures the ore surrounded, the chambers and tunnels and ventilation systems and water channels built by whoever was down there before the 19th century miners arrived. Those structures are still in place too. In the American West alone, the Bureau of Land Management maintains access restrictions on more than 245 million acres. Much of that land sits above geological formations the USCs has documented as significant. The underground surveys of those formations are not publicly available. This is a continental-scale secret maintained for over 100 years through the coordinated effort of federal land management agencies, the academic institutions controlling the narrative of pre-Columbian American history, and the corporate mining interests that were the first to encounter the evidence and the first to understand that acknowledging it would require acknowledging something the people in charge of this country's story were not prepared to face. A civilization was here, technologically sophisticated, working the underground resources of this continent at a scale we are only beginning to understand. Something ended it, and the evidence of its existence, the vast underground works it left behind, was sealed away over a single generation at the turn of the 20th century under the cover of an economic narrative about depleted ore bodies that has never held up to scrutiny. The ore ran out. That is what they told you. But the ore did not run out. The story ran out. The story that could explain what was in the mines ran out. And rather than find a new story, rather than face what the evidence actually showed, the people in charge of American history chose to seal the evidence underground and tell you that the mines were empty. They are not empty. They are waiting. If this is the first time you have gone down this particular rabbit hole, understand that everything discussed here is documented. The mine closure data is in the public record. The geological surveys are accessible in the portions not classified. The anomalous chamber reports are in the historical mining literature. The land restriction timeline tracks directly with the closure timeline. Whitfield, the Michigan copper scale, the crescent vug, these are not invented. They are in the archives. Before you dismiss any of it, look at the numbers. 7 zeros. 0 viable mining operations closed between 1880 and 1940 in a country supposedly building an industrial empire. Look at the USC survey records classified under a 1917 national security designation and never declassified. Look at the federally restricted underground access points across the most geologically significant land in the American West and ask yourself why. The answer is underground, and the people who sealed it down there were counting on you never asking. The video on your screen right now goes deeper into the Tartarian infrastructure evidence, the star forts, the mud flood deposits, the civic buildings that don't match their founding dates. If this raised questions for you, that video will raise more. Subscribe. The next one is coming soon. And it goes somewhere they really did not want us to.